how exactly did a recently developed round with little history at that time and exactly two major production pistols manage to find itself up for consideration by one of the major law enforcement agencies of the US federal government? Well, to answer this question, we need to go farther back to 1972. Is 10mm the best millimeter? The 10mm auto is an interesting round, going from seeking to fill a gap in the market to fading into obscurity, and now becoming a more popular, if still somewhat niche round. Yet the 10mm of today is really not what it seems, nor what it was originally envisioned to be. 10mm today truly is a strange beast. At once it seems to have those that swear by it, yet others who see it as a less practical stopgap. However, to talk about it, there are actually two other cartridges that we can't leave out of our story, as their histories are almost just as intertwined with the 10mm as its own. Today, on the Dead Calibers Archive, we'll talk about the 10mm, its various incarnations, and maybe give you some insight into why this round faded into the background and where it sits today, despite the modern hype around it. I'm Anders, E.T. Herzberg. Stay tuned. And of course, Dead Calibers is brought to you by Cap and Ball Digital Strategies, my personal digital marketing agency. We serve FFLs and others in the Second Amendment community, helping them grow their businesses through SEO and other digital marketing services. So if you'd like to learn more about how we can help you grow, visit us at capandballseo.com. Now, back to the show. Normally, I'd start at the beginning of the story, but the 10mm probably would not have the same level of notoriety if not for its consideration in the wake of one of the most notorious shootings that the FBI got into: the Miami shootout. While the topic has been discussed and dissected in much more detail than I deign to dictate at this demarcation, the necessary dictum that you need to discern is thus: 8 FBI agents armed with mostly revolvers, a semi-auto pistol, and a shotgun faced a Mini-14 wielding misanthrope and his partner. The agents ended up wounded or worse, and law enforcement was forced to reevaluate their tactics, training, and ammunition selections. While the exact lessons to be learned from this are arguable, Mr. Paul Harrell has a discussion that breaks down and summarizes the major lessons to be learned from the shooting for those that are interested in more detail. For our purposes today, one of the lessons that was learned from the Miami shootout was the need for better ammunition, as a single round of 9mm failed to sufficiently penetrate the Mini-14 wielding madman and end the fight with more immediacy. Beyond just better ammo, the FBI felt that they needed to move away from the 6-shot revolvers that they were using and move to semi-auto pistols as a standard. From the aftermath of the shootout, the FBI ballistics protocols were developed in 1987. These protocols set the standard that we use today: 12 to 18 inches of penetration into ballistics gel after passing through various barriers, such as glass, car door analogs, heavy denim clothing, and drywall. Of the various calibers that were tested, the main competitors were the 9mm and the 45 ACP. However, one caliber would be almost snuck into the running, a new cartridge and the centerpiece of our story today: the 10mm Auto. But how exactly did a recently developed round with little history at that time and exactly two major production pistols manage to find itself up for consideration by one of the major law enforcement agencies of the US federal government? Well, to answer this question, we need to go farther back to 1972. In 1972, firearms writer Whit Collins noted that there existed a gap between the two World Wars 45 ACP and the "it was meant to wound" 9mm Luger. Well, I'm sure that Collins was not the first to think to himself that, what if there was something between 9mm and 45 ACP? He was the first to actually do something about that. With the help of John French, he developed the first version of a 40 caliber 10mm semi-automatic pistol cartridge. Using modified 30 Remington rifle cases, Collins and French were able to create a round that pushed a 180 grain bullet to 1110 feet per second out of a 4.7-inch barrel, using a modified Browning high power as a test platform for this experiment. Well, this testing showed that the Wonder Nines of the era could be modified to fit a slightly larger round. Comfortably, the 40 GNA project that French and Collins were working on really failed to spark serious interest with any firearms or ammunition manufacturers, and their 40 GNA Wildcat faded into the background for over a decade. Basically, the collective gun industry went, neat, and promptly went back to arguing over 9mm versus 45 and how much more reliable revolvers were compared to semi-autos. Fast forward to 1983. Jeff Cooper, who probably needs no introduction to many shooters, but for the uninitiated, was a key driver of the modern handgun shooting technique. At this time, he is consulting for Dornhaus and Dixon on the pistol that would become to be known as the Bren 10. Essentially, Cooper, who was bringing in more shooting world star power than anyone else at the time, would have guaranteed that people would have been interested in the Bren 10 pistol simply because his name was attached to the project. However, Dornhaus and Dixon would do their best to screw up what should have been, on paper, an incredibly popular handgun. However, we'll get to the Bren 10 story in a little bit more detail later. When selecting a cartridge for the Bren 10 pistol, Cooper wanted more power than the 45 ACP or the 9mm. Having already been familiar with the 40 GNA Wildcat, Cooper liked the idea, but, wanting more power out of the round, he envisioned something slightly different. The goal would be to push a 200 grain bullet at 1200 feet per second. Some may note this is roughly similar to the goals of cartridges such as the 45 Super or the 460 Roland, but both of these rounds really should be topics for a later date. Cooper, with his industry fame, would be able to get Norma to take his design seriously, and Norma produced two factory loadings at first. A 170 grain jacketed hollow point at 1400 feet per second, and a 200 grain full metal jacket round at 1200 feet per second. However, it would become soon apparent that these loadings were just too much. Not just for the shooters, mind you, but for the guns themselves. Cooper wanted power, and he may have gotten too much of a good thing with these early 10mm loadings. The guns were battering themselves apart. Norma would eventually reduce the factory loadings. The 170 grain bullet would be slowed down to 1300 feet per second, and the 200 grain loading would be brought down to 1120 feet per second. Yet, Norma was not the only ones who noticed that the 10mm, as Jeff Cooper designed it, was a bit much for shooters and pistols. The FBI, during their ballistic studies and testing, would rapidly move to a lower power custom loading of the 10mm. This loading would push a 180 grain bullet 950 feet per second, and it would be informally known as the FBI 10mm Light. Developed specifically by Special Agent John Hall, the Firearms Training Unit Chief, if I am to understand correctly. Desiring a handgun for this round, the FBI would solicit manufacturers for a pistol to use this round. While others such as Sig Sauer were courted, it would be Smith & Wesson who would eventually take up this challenge, despite the corporate issues that they were dealing with at the time. Agents such as John Hall and the one who was responsible for including the 10mm in the testing himself were also wary of trying to ask for funding for a move from 9mm and 38 Special to 45 ACP, a round that the military had just spent a ton of money moving away from. Thus, the 10mm had another positive mark in its favor. Beyond performing well in the FBI's testing, it also had this bureaucratic pro to it as well. Now, Smith & Wesson was struggling at this time to maintain their hold on the law enforcement market, with the introduction of pistols such as the Glock 17 and other Wonder Nines. This was compounded by management issues and flagging quality control issues. Despite these challenges, Smith & Wesson would introduce the Model 1076, a modified Smith & Wesson auto pistol that integrated a frame-mounted decocker, possibly indicating that the FBI really wanted a SIG P200 series pistol, but they settled for Smith & Wesson's offering, unable to get SIG to produce a 10mm pistol for them, as they are rumored to have approached SIG about this and SIG apparently declined. In total, 9,500 pistols would be contracted for by the FBI from Smith & Wesson. However, this FBI light load that was being used would spur a revival of the 40 GNA. In the background to all of these events, the 40 GNA would have its development revived. Collins had taken back up work on the 40 GNA and would refine it into a new cartridge. The 165 grain bullet running at 1,075 feet per second would be christened the Centimeter. This round would see interest from Packmeyer, but commercial production of pistols would not start. Instead, the former customs shop manager at Packmeyer would leave and form his own gunsmithing business. This manager, Paul Leidenberg, would go on to produce 1911 conversions for the Centimeter, and it gained a following in the IPSC due to its higher capacity but equal scoring potential to the 45 ACP. Of these shooters, Tom Campbell, an employee at Smith & Wesson, would start to lobby for the 40 caliber Centimeter to be adopted by Smith & Wesson as a round to be marketed to specifically competition shooters. Due in part to Campbell's lobbying, Smith & Wesson would refine the round into the 40 Smith & Wesson that we have today for a first reveal at the 1990 Las Vegas SHOT Show. The Centimeter would, as it turns out, be able to match the 10mm loadings that the FBI were using in a smaller form factor, a perfect cartridge to pitch to the FBI and the general public at the same time. It was ballistically what the FBI wanted, and the shooting public was already technically familiar with it through its use in the IPSC. Now, as legend has it, our at the time upstart pistol designer, Gadsden Glock, would be in attendance to SHOT Show 1990. Most of the industry knew Gadsden Glock by reputation rather than on site, so Herr Glock was able to sneak over to Smith & Wesson's booth and pocket a few of the cartridges that Smith & Wesson was producing for their soon-to-be-released Model 4006 pistol. Glock found that the 17 could easily be retrofitted with a 40 caliber barrel and a slightly stiffer spring, allowing him to release the Glock 22 just weeks before Smith & Wesson would come to market with the round and pistol. While the drama over police contracts, the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge between Smith & Wesson and Glock would continue to play out for years to come, the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge would prove to be the very thing that the FBI was truly looking for. While the 10mm was a longer and larger case, the shorter 40 Smith & Wesson would prove to be just as effective when loaded properly as the light 10mm loadings that the FBI was using in their testing. Between this, the smaller cartridge offering an easier-to-manage pistol, and finally ongoing issues with the 1076 pistols failing to function, the 10mm found itself sidelined by the very round it helped to create, or spawned from, depending on how you want to look at it. Of course, the 40 Smith & Wesson would continue to be the default for the FBI and other law enforcement agencies for quite some time to come, until the ultimate decision to move over to 9mm. The 10mm, meanwhile, would languish in relative obscurity, but it would retain a strong cult following that endures to this day. Where the 40 Smith & Wesson has seen it fall out of favor, the 10mm is becoming regarded as the more powerful round. Many law enforcement agencies, especially those in Alaska or northern areas that need to deal with large animals, bear, moose, etc. on a regular basis, still use pistols chambered in the 10mm round because when properly loaded, it does remain an effective tool for dealing with these kinds of threats. Now, when it comes to 10mm pistols, there are some major pistols that we can discuss. Of course, no discussion of the 10mm auto should fail to leave out the Bren 10, as we mentioned earlier. Not only the gun that helped to popularize the 10mm auto as a cartridge, it was influenced by the guidance of Jeff Cooper in its design. The pistol was based primarily on the CZ75 9mm, scaled up to accept the 10mm cartridge that was developed alongside it. The pistol had a number of unique features. It could be carried cocked and locked, along with a cross-bolt safety on the slide. Almost uniquely, it was able to be adjusted so that the magazines could either drop free or be retained in the grip with a simple screw adjustment at the base of the grip. Metal sights meant for racking on a belt or boot, double action, single action trigger, high capacity, high power cartridge. It was designed with just about everything in the current cutting edge of pistol tactics and training in mind. Another feature was that the Bren 10's original magazines were designed to hold either 45 ACP or 10mm auto without any swapping. However, this is where the troubles start for this pistol. This design turned out to be a poor one, and magazines failed to be reliable. The magazine OEM Metgar had to redesign a dedicated 10mm magazine, and this led to many guns being shipped without magazines at all. I'm not even an engineer, and I struggle to think why they thought this would be a good idea. It just sounds like an easy way to make an unreliable magazine, at least to me. Beyond this, Dornhaus and Dixon utilized MIM'd parts, but failed to do proper quality control, leading to even further issues with reliability and durability. And pair that with a hot round like the 10mm, that when loaded to normal specifications, the gun would beat itself up, and you get a recipe for problems. This led to Dornhaus and Dixon eventually becoming trapped in a negative cash cycle. Guns would go out, but come right back in for repairs, eating into their profits and keeping the company permanently in the red. Due to this, the company soon shuttered in 1987 with only about 1,400 pistols in total produced. There were, however, 3 versions created: a standard model, a Jeff Cooper commemorative model, and a tactical model with a 4-inch barrel. Today, the pistol retains a bit of a cult collector following, with examples becoming rather sought after because of the history and associations of the pistol, both in the shooting world with Jeff Cooper and popular media with Miami Vice having featured the pistol predominantly. The next notable pistol for the 10mm auto was the Colt Delta Elite. This was the pistol that the FBI was using during its testing of the 10mm auto. Colt, seeing the potential of the 10mm cartridge, essentially took their 1911 pattern pistol and scaled it up slightly for the 10mm round, releasing the Delta Elite just as the Bren 10 was falling out of the market. Several versions of the Delta Elite were produced, with Gold Cup and Match versions. However, there were some changes beyond slight geometry adjustments. The Delta Elite would use a nested recoil spring design to help deal with slide velocity issues. A cutout would be made into the side of the frame to deal with stress fractures, again due to the more powerful 10mm cartridge. This would become more common actually on 1911 pistols, even those not chambered in 10mm. For the Delta Elite, models could be found either in blue or stainless, with a DE prefix on the serial number for the blued models and DES for the stainless steel ones. Beyond this, the Delta Elite was essentially just another 1911, for better or for worse. Another major pistol in the 10mm auto story is the Smith & Wesson Model 1076 that we've already touched on a little bit. The 1076 was much the same as many Smith & Wesson's third generation of auto-loading pistols of that era, but as previously noted, the slide-mounted decocker would be removed in favor of a framed-mounted one. While the FBI would contract for 9,500 pistols, the reliability issues and the eventual switch to 40 Smith & Wesson would see only 2,400 of these pistols actually be delivered to the FBI. The 1076 would live on in the civilian market, however, kind of, in the 1006, but the 1006 would retain the slide-mounted decocker of its brothers and sisters. Both the 1076 and the 1006 were full-size guns that featured double-action, single-action triggers, and like much of Smith & Wesson's pistols of the era, they were fine. I've owned a 9mm Smith & Wesson of this era before, and it was nothing amazing, but I couldn't overly fault it either. I started shooting revolvers and have never been overly snobbish about long and heavy triggers, even though they are objectively worse than a short, crisp, single action trigger. Finally, we should briefly discuss the Glock 20, probably the mainstay of modern 10mm handguns. Of course, it's a Glock, the same size as the G21 and 45 ACP, just running 10mm. If you know Glocks, you probably know the G20. It just kicks harder. But where does the 10mm stand today? Here's something I'll probably get a little bit of hate for. Okay, maybe a lot of hate for. I need to break it to you that most of today's 10mm loadings are pretty much 40 Smith & Wesson plus P. Comparing the 180 grain Hydroshock out of a 5-inch barrel in both calibers gives you 1069 feet per second for 10mm and 1051 for 40 Smith & Wesson. This kind of issue is not just apparent on the 180 grain Hydroshock. Plenty of other loadings have this exact same issue. Now, granted, there are much more hotter loads for 10mm than just this, but you really should be aware that most of the 10mm loadings on the market are just above 40 Smith & Wesson at best, and not to the same standards as the original Norma loadings that the cartridge was first using. Remember the metrics that I quoted earlier. Norma started out with a 170 grain load at 1400 feet per second, then reduced that to 1300 feet per second. This is where the 10mm was originally supposed to be. The two that I am aware of that truly give the 10mm the power it's supposed to have are loadings from Buffalo Bore and Underwood. The rest are patterned more closely to the light FBI loadings or slightly hotter. Basically, if you're shooting a 40 Smith & Wesson today, that's pretty much the 10mm loading and ballistics that the FBI wanted from their original testing in 1987 at their ballistics lab. So, unless a 10mm loading exceeds the 40 Smith & Wesson baseline, it's not a full power 10mm, and you might as well run a 40 Smith & Wesson to get that shorter grip diameter, if that's more comfortable for your hands. Also, you have a slight disadvantage in that it's a longer case and the reliability issues that can induce with the 10mm auto. But with all cartridges, it's a trade-off. There's no such thing as a free lunch for anything. Tweak one thing here, and all of a sudden you have a problem over there that you might not necessarily have realized. Perhaps that's why the cartridges that we are using today are so bloody old. The 9mm Luger is essentially a 124-year-old design. Sure, we've tinkered with bullet and powder, but the dimensions are roughly the same. Much bigger, you start sacrificing capacity, or you get a gun that's more difficult to use effectively. Much smaller, and you start losing even more effectiveness in a handgun format. ICU 5.7 fans, don't come at me. I'm not knocking that either. I'm just trying to not get too far into the weeds. I'll give 5.7 and other rounds its due eventually. But let's get back on track here. Now, all of this is not to say that the 10mm auto does not have a place in the modern American arsenal. Tim Sundles of Buffalo Bore has done a number of discussions about the 10mm and other magnum power semi-auto calibers. The long and short of it, if I may attempt to drive at what Mr. Sundles is getting at, and he's welcome to correct me if I'm wrong, is that the 10mm is a good handgun hunting round because it carries a flatter trajectory and more energy over distance. However, Mr. Sundles seems to prefer a larger caliber round such as the 45 ACP Plus or 45 Super for a stopping round, i.e. a round that is meant to immediately stop a charging animal. I'll defer you to his videos on the topic for a more in-depth discussion of those various calibers and how they compare to one another. Tim Sundles has plenty of hunting experience and started Buffalo Bore, so I have little reason to doubt his expertise, even if some of his data is anecdotal. As much as I love experiments with repeatable results, hard measurements, and studies, I can't completely discount firsthand hard-won experience in the ultimate synthesis of effective ballistics. Plenty of projects of the SPEW era of military development showed us, as good as it looks on paper, that shine might not really translate to the real world where you have hundreds of other variables that you can't account for easily. But what about outside hunting? Well, I could see the argument for a pistol caliber carbine in 10mm. Looking at ballistics by the inches historical data, the 10mm auto out of a 16-inch barrel is within spitting distance of the 223 when it comes to energy at the muzzle. Now, this comes with the caveat that you're probably sacrificing magazine capacity or ammo compatibility with your pistol, or you're now carrying around a 10mm pistol that's more challenging to use compared to a 9mm and more expensive to train with. And you're still running a pistol caliber. A good pistol caliber, but still a pistol caliber nonetheless. Now, in a pistol format, the 10mm is, like all handguns, an inconsistent at best man-stopper. Younger viewers might not be as ingrained with this particular bit of FUD lore when it comes to handguns. There is no such thing as stopping power. Tales and anecdotes about such and such, World War II killed him with one shot, yada yada yada, it's not real. What is real with pistols is a hit to the central nervous system. Hit that and someone will stop. Hit the heart and they may have a few minutes. Now, I have yet to see any data beyond an individual self-defense situation that suggests that a specific handgun caliber has any major advantage against a person over any other caliber. I am open to be wrong about this, however. My current and best understanding is that no matter what you do to it, pistols suck, rifles get stuff done. And honestly, that's probably because of what is getting holes poked into it. Let me explain my reasoning. Humans are thin-skinned, weird animals that can keep going at times when an animal with the same kind of damage would have given into shock. Conversely, humans can be more susceptible to a psychological stop in some ways. Going batshit, freezing, or otherwise just locking up because an acorn hit a car door next to them. But in all of this strangeness, no handgun has really been shown to be as effective as a rifle, screaming out of a much longer barrel with a larger powder charge. But, of course, when dealing with combat, self-defense, etc., the best gun is the one that you have, and I'm not one of the men who's called out to do dangerous things in dangerous places with dangerous people. So, take my opinion for what it's worth. Just another opinion. Subject to all of the associated fallibility and human error, and limited by the resources and training that I have access to. So, at least for me, while I am still fond of the 10mm and its son, the 40 Smith & Wesson, I understand that being able to train and more easily control recoil with the 9mm are factors that win out, at least for me and most people when it comes to a handgun. Your personal preferences and particular persuasions are, of course, permitted to persist with no pessimistic projections or pontifications from yours truly. You do you. I'm not going to knock you for enjoying or carrying something that's not 9mm. I would just encourage you to train with it. Thus, we come to the last bit that I would like to point out as something worth discussing, for no reason than it may be dangerous. Occasionally, it is said that 40 Smith & Wesson can be shot out of a 10mm chamber. Please don't do this. First, I will never encourage a shooter to use ammunition that is not intended for your firearm. And while there are plenty of silly this and not that in the world of 5.56, this is one situation where it's ill-advised to risk yourself and your firearm by trying to shoot a much shorter cased 40 Smith & Wesson out of a 10mm pistol. You can see what overpressure events look like when this is tried. Some success has been noted with striker-fired guns, but you're doing something that's rolling the dice. The meme of, if it seats, it eats, is probably the most dangerous idea out there. Please don't risk it. So, with that public service announcement out of the way, let's wrap up the video. Honestly, I am somewhat happy that 10mm is getting a bit of a second win today. It's a good case, and I think a 10mm PPC could be an excellent option for getting a bit more oomph out of a carbine when loaded like it should be. 10mm is decent enough out of a handgun to go hunting deer with, even slightly larger game, and I'm certain no one with ill intent would want to be on the wrong side of the muzzle of such a hand cannon. However, you should be certain your gun is set up for the real 10mm loadings if that's what you're going to be shooting out of them on a regular basis. The bottom line is this: 10mm is a good round, and while it does have its weaknesses that should be pointed out, such as recoil, many lighter loadings on the market, and a propensity to be a more expensive option, I would encourage you to examine your use case for it and see if it's something that makes sense for you or not. It remains a round worth considering if you are looking for more power from a pistol or pistol caliber carbine for use especially in backwoods and hiking situations. So with that wraps up this episode of the Dead Calibers Archives. I do want to thank everyone for watching. The Dead Calibers Archives is a ton of fun for me, digging into the history of various calibers and the guns that shoot them. 10mm is especially fascinating because its development is so tied into that of the 40 Smith & Wesson as well as law enforcement history. There's so much more that we could unpack here, but we would be here forever. Right now, my current goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers, so I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you have any personal experience with 10mm? Is it your favorite caliber, or do you just not like it? Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. Beyond the Dead Calibers Archive, we also have the Cap and Ball Saloon, a podcast dedicated to the Second Amendment in the digital age, where we talk about industry news, developments, as well as other topics related to the Second Amendment today. So, I'd like to thank you guys all for watching. I'm Anders, E.T. Herzberg, and I'm hoping to see you all again real soon.
Gunsmith, the best in the land, with a steady-eyed aim and a rock-steady hand. He swore on his life there was one thing he'd find, a bullet so perfect it'd leave fate behind. He cast his own lid, he loaded them tight, but something kept telling him, boy, it ain't right. So he packed up his bags, took to the road, chasing a legend that ballistics foretold. He's looking for the bullet, the one that don't stray. It's like thunder and don't fade away. Silver or brass, copper, steel, he won't rest till he finds one that's real. Kentucky, a mountain man swore, I once saw a bullet that cut through the war. It flew like a whisper, it struck like a blade, and the man who fired it, he never got paid. Hank took to Texas, then down to the bayou. A voodoo queen whispered, boy, I know about you. She gave him a casing, all etched with a rune, said fire it once and you'll know the truth soon. He's looking for the bullet, the line that don't stray. It's like thunder and don't fade away. Silver, brass, copper or steel, he won't rest till he finds one that's real. He took that old bullet, lined up the sights, pulled back the hammer and prayed it flew right. The gunpowder flared, the mountains did shake, and Hank felt the earth and his soul separate. Well, the shot never echoed, the bullet still flew. It circled the world, then it split right in two. One half hit the devil, the other the sky. And Hank just stood laughing, cause he knew he'd found why. He found the perfect bullet, but the price was too high. It don't miss its target, it don't say goodbye. Some legends ain't meant for a man to unseal. Some things are best left to the steel. Old Hank disappeared, some say he's a ghost, still searching for answers he wanted the most. But if you hear a shot with no echo at night, you best say your prayers, cause it flies straight